Hello, Shavua Tov, everybody. Good vach, and thank you so much for joining me. For those who are joining for a Shabbos HaGadol Drasha, uh, the this year is a little different because the last couple of years we've been completely online. This year I had the great zuchus, the opportunity, the privilege of giving a drasha in shul in person, which was obviously personally something that was gratifying to be back in person and to participate in giving the drasha in a more traditional setting. That being said, I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to once again offer those who were unable to join us today the opportunity to participate in our learning, our coming together, and thinking and preparing together for Yom Tif. Tonight's shir is called in no small measure, but the smallest piece of matzah can teach us about the bigger things in life. And what I'd like to talk about is a question. I'd like to start talking about a halachic question that I imagine many people would not believe is an actual question, but it actually is. It's a question that has been asked throughout the ages, and even to this very day, although not necessarily a common situation, there are many people out there who may, from time to time, find themselves in a situation where they are seeking guidance in this area. What exactly is the question? So the question, as put forth by the Ben Ish Chai in the Sefer Shabbos Teshuvos Rav Pa'alim, which is the first source on the page, involves an individual who is told by his doctor that he is unable to eat matzah and to drink wine at the Seder. Unfortunately, because of his health condition, his doctor is very concerned that eating matzah and drinking wine, certainly the required amounts, would be very unhealthy for him, and is concerned that it could have potentially some very negative consequences. And so that is not the question, because as we know, as the Ben Ish Chai just mentions from the outset, obviously we need to listen to the doctor, and the person's health comes first. If the doctor is telling him that this is something which is not safe, which can be dangerous, then of course he's not going to eat the matzah and drink the wine. However, this individual says to the doctor, is it okay for me to eat a little matzah? What about drinking a little bit of wine? Is that something which is acceptable? And the doctor said, yeah, I'm okay with that. It sounds like there's no problem whatsoever. So the individual then goes back to the rabbi, in this case the Ben Ish Chai, and he says, well, am I obligated to do so? Is there a mitzvah? Is there an opportunity for me to be able to fulfill a mitzvah of achilas matzah if I cannot fulfill it in the optimal fashion, if I cannot eat an entire shear of matzah? In somewhat of a similar question, although different circumstances, the second source on the page comes from the Shabbos Teshuvos Mizrach Shemesh, which were written by the chief rabbi of Hong Kong, who was addressing a situation where he had a group of tourists who came and announced that they were interested in participating in his Pesach Seder 2 hours before the start of Yom Tif. Very nice. He was happy to welcome the 40 travelers who were not on the guest list beforehand. The problem is he didn't have enough matzah for all of them. So the question that he had is whether or not he should offer all of his guests some matzah, thereby allowing everybody to participate in the mitzvah partially, but nobody would really be fulfilling the mitzvah in the proper fashion. Or would it be best to say, listen, I don't have enough matzah to give everybody kazayis. So therefore, what I'm going to do is we're going to come up with some system where I'm going to give matzah for some people, but the rest will have to just sort of sit around and watch. So this was the question that was posed in the second shuva, and this is what I'd like to talk about tonight. Like I said, I actually received several questions already this year from individuals who have very significant health concerns, which prevent them from being able to eat or drink significant quantities of matzah and wine. And although, truth be told, it could very well be that a kazayis of matzah is not nearly as big as some of us believe it is, but there may be individuals who, because of some very specific diet restrictions, may be very limited in terms of what it is that they can eat. So this is what we're going to explore, I would say, for the first half of this year. Don't hold me to that, but I would like in this more traditional Shabbos HaGadol Drasha to start off with a halachic, a lumdish topic, and then we're going to try to spend some time discussing some of the hashkafic implications, some of the more philosophical, thoughtful implications of this idea. So what this all comes down to is the fact that the Torah tells us, we're going to talk about matzah as being sort of the case example that we're going to study. The matzah, the Torah tells us that we are to eat matzah. Be'erev tochlu matzos, as the pasuk says in source number 4. You should eat matzah. And although the Torah is not explicit in terms of what that means, namely, how much does a person have to eat in order for something to qualify as eating, through Torah Sheba'al Peh, we do know that ein achila pechusa mikazayis, that in order for a person to satisfy, in this case, an obligation of eating, they have to have at least what's called a kazayis, which is the size of an olive. Another time we can talk about how big that is and how we measure a kazayis when we're talking about matzah. But leaving that aside for the moment, there is a required shear, and that shear is a kazayis. Now, the Gemara does not discuss explicitly the question of having less than a kazayis. The Gemara just simply tells us and takes for granted that achila is no less than a kazayis. Where this does come up in the Gemara is involving a situation where a person wants to, or as the Gemara is discussing a hypothetical situation regarding a person who is going to eat a chatzi shear of an iser, a prohibited food. So let's use as an example shrimp. Don't ask me why I'm using shrimp as an example, but having never had any shrimp, I'll use it in an example. So, person wants to taste shrimp. Now, he knows he's not allowed to eat shrimp. He knows shrimp is not kosher. He goes to the store. He buys a small piece of shrimp, and he brings it home, and he makes sure that it's less than a kazayas. So, it's less than a kazayas of shrimp. So, is it permissible for him to eat that? The Torah, of course, prohibits someone from eating non-kosher fish. So, this doesn't qualify as being a kosher food. On the other hand, it's what we call a chatzi shear. It is only a partial amount of the full measure of a kazayas. So this is discussed in the Gemara, and that's in source number 6, where the Gemara says chatzi shear. Rabbi Yochanan says osir min Torah. You are not permitted to do that. Even eating less than a shear is going to be a prohibition on a Torah level, says Rabbi Yochanan. Rish Lakish disagrees. Rish Lakish says it is mutter min Torah. Rabbi Yochanan explains his position, and I'm going to translate this literally now, and we'll come back to it a little later to discuss what it may mean. Rabbi Yochanan says it's asmin Torah, kevan the chazi litztrufe, because it's possible to be mitzarif, to join the different pieces together, isura ka'achil, that this person is eating something which is prohibited. This is something which is not acceptable. Rish Lakish says it's mutar min Torah. Why? Because achila merachmana v'leka, because the Torah says you cannot eat, and over here he's technically not eating. In the halacha, we follow the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says that a chatzi shear of an iser is asur on a Torah level. So therefore, based on this, we're going to reflect upon the question as to whether or not this is something which applies necessarily to a case of a mitzvah. So over here, what I'm going to try to do in the time that we have is share with you, why is that not working? Share with you several different explanations that are found in or 7 different arguments rather, that we find in the Achronim that discusses. The Shuvas Yaakov suggests that we can perhaps bring a proof from a particular case, which I'll share with you in a moment, that eating less than a shear of matzah does not qualify as a mitzvah. That is not considered mitzvah. What is his attempt to prove that? He drives us from a halacha which is found in Shulchan Aruch regarding a person who takes a shvua. He takes a vow that he's not going to eat any matzah throughout the year. A person says, I'm not going to eat matzah for a year. I don't like matzah, and that's it. I'm on strike. I'm on matzah strike. And he swears. He takes a vow. I swear I'm not going to eat any matzah for a year. What does he do come Pesach time? This individual is not going to eat matzah. He's not going to eat matzah. Now, says the Shuvas Yaakov, the halacha is that when a person takes a shvua, the shvua, which he says, person takes a shvua, I'm not going to eat, that only applies to something which is a kazayas. So we should have the perfect solution for this guy. Let him eat less than a kazayas of matzah. Let him eat less than a kazayas of matzah. And this way, he will not be in violation of his oath. He will not have violated the vow that he took. However, he would, on some level, be mekayim the mitzvah of matzah. But that's not what we say. What it says in Shulchan Aruch is that such an individual, in source number 11, does not eat matzah on Pesach. So what do you see from there? You see from there, says the Shuvas Yaakov, that there is in fact no mitzvah whatsoever to eat pachos mikashir. This is the argument of the Shuvas Yaakov. However, others disagree. The Chidah in the Sefer Machzik Bracha says that this is not a proof at all, because the idea that the Shuvas Yaakov is pointing out that it says in Shulchan Aruch that when a person takes a shvu and he's not going to eat something, it only applies to kazayis. That's only regarding the bringing of a karban if a person violates his shvua. However, regarding the actual isser of eating, the concept of a pachos mikashir applies even when a person takes a shvua. Okay, so that's one attempted argument which has been debated. Another one involves a case which is found in Maseches Yoma. Over there, the Gemara records a brisa, a rather lengthy brisa, which I recommend seeing inside. It's on Daf Testament Aleph. But the Gemara over there talks about the fact that when Shimon HaTzadik was the Kohen Gadol, it was a time of great success and great abundance, and there was apparent shefa bracha. There was clear blessing in the Beis HaMikdash in so many different ways that it was manifest. And one of the examples that the Gemara mentions is that when Shimon HaTzadik was the Kohen Gadol, there was a bracha there was such a bracha, there was a blessing that was found specifically by the korban omer, which we brought on Pesach, the korban shtei lechem, which was brought on Shavuos, and the lechem apanim, the bread that was replaced each and every week in the Beis Hamikdash. How so? That kol hakohen shemegio kazayis yesh ochel v'saveya, that every kohen would come and it would taste even a kazayis, and it would be so satisfying, meaning the nutritional quality of this food was so dense, it was so rich, that a Kohen would have a relatively small amount and be satiated. So this was a sign, this was a display of tremendous bracha from Hashem. On the other hand, or not on the other hand, Mikan ve'elach, once Shimon HaTzadik had left his position and is replaced by somebody who unfortunately did not elicit the same divine blessing, unfortunately, there was a curse that was evident within these very same sacrifices, and a Kohen would receive only a small amount, the size of a pole of like a bean, and hatznuin, here's the key line, moshchenes yadeyen, that tznuin would withdraw their hands, meaning they wouldn't even take a small amount, but garganin, notlin v'ochen, the people were very gluttonous, they would come and they would take more. So, based on this, says the Minchas Chinuch, what do you see from here? You see from here something very interesting, and that is that you had a time in the Beis Hamikdash where Kohanim were in a position to partake, to participate in eating of the lechem apanim, the korban omer, the shtei lechem, but because they were only being offered less than a kazayas, they chose not to take. They were moshchenes yadeya, and they said, thanks, but no thanks, I'm not going to have. So what do you see from there? You see clearly it's not a mitzvah, because if it was a mitzvah, even though they weren't getting the full amount, of course, they would still benefit from having a pachos mikashir. But the fact that they didn't take that says the Minchas Chinuch shows that there is no mitzvah when eating a pachos mikashir. However, the Chida points out that this is not necessarily a good raya. And why does he say it's not a good raya? He says because it could very well be that the reason why these individuals, who the Torah, the Gemara rather describes as snuin, they were modest in the sense that they were not looking to push their way to the front of the line just to go ahead and to grab a little piece, which at the end of the day would not amount to a kazayis. Meaning, it could very well have been that there would have been a kiyum mitzvah on a pachos mikashir, that even less than a shir would also have qualified as a mitzvah. However, because it would not have been a mitzvah shlema, it would not have been the complete mitzvah, they were not interested in putting them in a sad situation where they would go ahead and push their way through. And so therefore, since they were tznuin, they said in order to avoid machlokes, in order from taking it from people who wanted, so therefore they decided to sort of opt out. That was the position that they had taken. And so therefore, based on that, says the Chida, that I don't know that the Minchas Chinuch is necessarily correct in his assessment. Another attempt to prove this comes once again from the Ben Ish Chai. The Ben Ish Chai tries to bring a raya from a completely different example. This one having to do with Sfiras HaOmer. Really, this is very interesting, because over here we're now stepping into a completely different realm within halacha. We're not talking about eating right now. And the Ben Ish Chai says as follows. He says, we all know that the Shulchan Aruch teaches, based on the opinion of the Bahag, that if a person misses a day of Sfira, an entire day goes by and they don't count, so they are no longer able to count with a bracha. The reason is because, according to the Bahag, every day is one part of a big mitzvah. And because the Torah says, Sheva Shabbosos Temimos Tiana, you need 7 complete weeks. If any part of that is deficient, is missing, is lacking, so then that's it. Then you're out, and you can no longer fulfill the mitzvah, at least in the most optimal fashion. Now, we all know that. So says Ben Ish Chai as follows. He says, it's very interesting that Chazal told each and every one of us that we should go ahead and recite a bracha every night of Sfira, knowing that invariably there are going to be individuals who unfortunately are going to forget to count one day. That's just what happens. My guess, based on, I haven't taken any, I have no data to back this up, but my guess is worldwide, there are probably thousands of people who don't necessarily make it to the end on any given year. But yet, we all say a bracha, hoping and expecting that we will. Now, how do we do that? After all, if I miss a night, doesn't that mean that every night until that point, every day that I recited a bracha was a bracha of batala? Isn't that what that should mean? So argues the Ben Ish Chai. Now, that is his argument, and therefore he says the fact that we are not restricted from reciting a bracha. What does that show us? It shows that there is a kiyum mitzvah in what's called, in this case, a chatzi shir of the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer. That's what he says. Very interesting. He says the fact of the matter is that you may have only counted 3 weeks, you may have only counted 4 weeks, you may have not made it to the end, but you did something. There was a chatzi shir there, and therefore it's not a bracha levatala. So was his argument. But Ravad Yosef in the Chuvas Chazon Avadia, so he actually says that I'm not sure that Ben Ish Chai's proof is a good proof. And he says, I will tell you why. He says the halacha is, the Ritva brings down that if a person washes their hand, let's say a person wants to have a snack midday and decides that, I'm going to have a bagel, even though it's just snack time. Maybe you don't have to sit down for a whole meal, but a person is very hungry. So they wash and they make a bracha, al netilas yadayim, and they sit down and then they realize, what, I really shouldn't be having a bagel now. I feel bad. Probably should wait for dinner. So they decide not to eat the bagel. Are they allowed to do that? Or since they washed and we said a bracha, that's it. You got to go weiter. You have to eat the bagel. Says the Ritva, source number 26. If a person washes his hand and recites Al Netilas Yadayim, makes the bracha, and then changes mind, and he says, I don't want to eat, that's okay. Ein v'kach klum. It's not a problem. You don't have to eat. Why? Because since when you washed your hands, you had every intention of having a meal. The fact that you change a meal doesn't change anything. It doesn't make it a bracha levatala after the fact. So says Ravad Yosef, the same should be true over here. When a person counts svira, he's hoping that I'm going to make it to the end. He intends to fulfill the mitzvah in the most shalem fashion. Unfortunately, at a certain point, you may forget a day, but that doesn't mean that everything retroactively is going to be considered a bracha levatala. So argues Ravad Yosef. Another attempt to resolve this question can be found in a Gemara in Maseches Rosh Hashanah Daf Lamed Daled, which is recorded La Halacha in source number 32, regarding the following unusual situation. Let's say you have a shul that only has one Baal Tokeah, one person who could blow Rosh Hashanah, blow shofar in Rosh Hashanah, and unfortunately for them, this particular Baal Tokeah does not know how to make every sound on the shofar. He knows he's got the tekiah down, but he doesn't really know the shvarim well, and the trua, forget it, he can't really do it. So he says to the rabbi, listen, I can do a great tekiah. You're going to love my tekiahs. It's amazing. Everybody in shul is going to be inspired by my tekiahs. So the rabbi says, can you do a shvarim? What about trua? No, I can't do it. So what do? Do we say, let's call him up for what he can do? So as the Gemara says in Maseches Rosh Hashanah, no, that the tekiyos and ma'akvos zuazu, that if you cannot make every one of the sounds that are required, then don't make any of them. So what do you see from here? Says the Sefer Yeshua in source number 34, you see that a chatzi shir by a mitzvah is not qualified as a mitzvah. It doesn't qualify. Why? Because here you have a Baal Tokeah who, unfortunately, he doesn't know how to make every sound, but he makes beautiful tekiyos. So let him do what he can do. So argues the Sefer Yeshua, so you see that a chatzi shir by a mitzvah does not count. However, several achronim, when considering this argument, say that that's not really a great svara. That's not really true. Why? Because over here, the Steichemes says this, and later on, there's a quote from Rav Aaron Kotler who said a similar thing. He says this is a little different. What we've been talking about until now is, let's say you have a piece of matzah. The matzah is 100% bona fide matzah. It's the mitzvah. It's the right. The only thing is you can't have the entire amount. So the question is, what do I get? What is the value of having a chatzi shir, a partial measure of a whole mitzvah? However, over here, when you have a person who can only make a tekiah without a shvarim, or can only make a shvarim without a tekiah, so then in that case, you don't have a mitzvah shalom. You don't have a whole mitzvah. That's not a chatzi shir. That's a chatzi mitzvah. That would be like a person saying, I only have water, but I don't have flour. I only have flour and I have water. That's not matzah. Matzah is when you have the flour and water baked together and it's done properly, then you have a matzah. And now you have to have a certain shir. So therefore, this doesn't prove anything. You can't necessarily bring a raya from here. Furthermore, the case could be made, Ravad Yosef makes this in source number 38, that anyway, the whole discussion of chatzi shir is not one that should be necessarily applied to areas outside of eating. It could be that fundamentally, this entire conversation is really, really rooted in the conversation having to do with food and achila and our definitions of achila, and it's not really something that we should apply elsewhere. But coming back to the question, we're going to now try to think about this from more of a sort of a foundational perspective, and rather than consider the various arguments this way, that way, try to think about conceptually what would make most sense. Again, the question that is being discussed this evening is, what is the halacha regarding a person who cannot eat the entire shir of matzah, but can only have, let's say, chatzi kazayis? Is it worth it? Is there anything to be gained by doing that? So regarding this question, the Achronim who discussed it do articulate a very fascinating svara as to how we could perhaps resolve this question. And it is based on coming back to the original statement of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan, which is found in source number 39, we saw this earlier, but I I recorded the source again here for you, says that Chatzi Shir is also Torah. Why? Because Chazi Litztrufa Yisura Ka'achil. Because since it is possible to join the various parts together, that the different parts of the food that I'm eating join together, so therefore what I'm eating now is an Isser. So how do we understand that? What exactly is Rabbi Yochanan saying? So there are basically two approaches in the Achronim to explain Rabbi Yochanan's Svara. Approach number one, Rav Asher Weiss in the Tif Ben Chasasha records this very, very simply and succinctly, but this is found in many Svarim. He says the first approach is that it is like a gezerah. A gezerah is a decree. So there are times that Chazal go ahead and they impose certain restrictions on us because they are afraid that we will come to violate a certain prohibition in the Torah. So the one approach is that this is a gezerah. What? How so? The kevan the chatzi shir chazi litzrufe. Since it's possible for this chatzi shir to join with another one, vayidei achilas chatzi shir karov adam lavor b'shir shalem. It is possible that if I eat this half, I'll come to eat another half. Therefore, asvatar of chatzi shir karchaka, the Torah is going to prohibit even a chatzi shir as a harchaka to keep me a distance away from shaliyavalech shir shalem. That's one approach to understand chazi litzrufe. It's a gezerah. Another way to understand the Svar of Chazi Litzrufe is not that it's an explanation as that it's a siba, that it's a reason, but rather it's a siman. It is a sign. It is a hochacha. How so? The Kevani says the Bashir Shalem. When I eat an entire shir, yesh la v'chatas. There are consequences to that. I have violated a prohibition of the Torah. There's a carbon chatas. Behechrech, I'm forced to say the b'chol mashahu, with every small amount, yesh chefza di yisura. There is something there which is a chefza d'isur. There is something there which is prohibited. The lo yitaken shechatzi shir heter gamrahu v'rakashlamas hashir goreres chet v'yavon. It doesn't make sense to simply say that everything until that point was heter gamor. There was nothing wrong with eating every small little piece of shrimp. And as soon as I get to the shir shalem, so there's going to be now a chet that's going to kick in. That doesn't make sense. So therefore, based on this, in the Sefer Derech HaMelech, in his Perush on the Rambam, he basically explains that we can use this as a way perhaps to understand how to approach this question. That maybe, he says, if we understand that the reason why Chatzi Shir is Asr by an Isser is because it's a Gezerah, then a Gezerah doesn't apply when it comes to a mitzvah. We wouldn't say that that same logic applies over here when we're talking about eating a half a Gazais of Matzah. Remember, the first question that we had is whether or not a person who cannot eat a Shir Shalim of Matzah still benefits, gains anything by eating a Chatzi Shir. If the whole reason why a Chatzi Shir by an Isser is Asr because it will lead to something else, that doesn't apply over here. However, that is usher by an isser, it's because every small piece is a cheptze di isura. Every small piece is something which, when added together with the other parts, becomes a shir shalem. That absolutely applies when it comes to a mitzvah. We could certainly apply that same logic when it comes to a mitzvah, that every small piece of this mitzvah adds up to something big. That's the way we look at it. And so therefore, based on this, we would say that there is, in fact, value in eating a chatzi shir mitzvah. This question is, for the most part, unresolved in the Achronim. There's no clear consensus. I will say that the sense I seem to get is that, at the very least, it is considered harmless, and very possibly it is considered to be valuable for no other reason than it displays a genuine interest and a commitment to want to perform a mitzvah. We have all heard stories, I'm sure, of individuals who, through great sacrifice in situations, unfortunately, whether it's in the Holocaust and concentration camps, and DP camps, there are stories of people of former Soviet Union with very limited resources and access to the things that we take for granted today, be it matzah, morah, dalakosas, whatever the case may be, and pull together pieces here and there. And you hear these stories, they're the most inspiring story in the world. You never say to yourself, I don't know, did it really have a kazayas? You don't say that because we're just inspired by the tremendous Mesiras Nefesh. So the poskim do talk about this, do encourage individuals. I would say as well that it can give people tremendous chizuk. Even if it doesn't necessarily qualify as being the mitzvah, even if we're not going to say that, we're not going to go as far as to say that this is a chefza the mitzvah, but there's no question that when a person displays a genuine interest and is able to a certain extent to perform some measure of their to demonstrate, to exercise, to actually realize their desire to perform a mitzvah, that is on a certain level, on a psychological level, and maybe on a metaphysical level, that is something which is certainly worthy of praise. And that would certainly be my recommendation to anybody who finds himself in this situation. What I would like to do right now, however, is to pivot a little bit and to spend the balance of our time talking about the svar of Chazi Litzdufe from a more of a hashkafic perspective. this idea that the term that we found in the Gemara from Rabbi Yochanan, the Chazi Litztufe, that it is possible to sort of take the different parts and piece them together. Now, what I'd like to do over here is talk just how, in general, we have a tendency in life. I think we all have this tendency to look at every aspect of life in a very sort of disjointed way. So much of what we experience is processed in a way in which we ignore the context, the connection between the different things, and very often it's just like an endless stream of disconnected dots. First and foremost, the way we process information. This is the way we are designed. This is not a failure, a human failure, but we are unable to really process more than just a few chunks of information in short-term memory at any given time. At any point in time, there are only very, very few things that we can actually access in our short-term memory. And it's important to know this because, unfortunately, technology that we are exposed to today continues to confuse us with this great lie that we are capable of multitasking in a way that really, really, as human beings, we are not really capable of doing. We are not able to multitask on a level that the technology that we use tries to entice us to do. And so therefore we are very often distracted, terribly distracted, because of the fact that we have so many balls in the air at the same time. So first and foremost, it should be noted that this is part of human nature. But on a deeper level, when you think about emotions, the way we process emotion, very often we think about emotions in very absolute terms. So good emotion, it's a bad emotion. I seek certain experiences because I'm attracted to them because they make me feel good, and then I avoid others because I don't like the way they make me feel. The way we process experiences. What did you do yesterday? What are you planning to do tomorrow? I don't know about you, but I'll take up my phone, I'll look at my calendar, and I'll just look at my schedule and say, okay, in the morning I have this, and oh, you want to speak? Okay, so I have like a half hour here, I have an hour there. And the day sort of comes together as just a collection of a lot of just completely disconnected and disjointed parts. And very rarely, again, I'm speaking for myself, do I look at my schedule? Do I look at my day? Do I look at my week? Either looking forward or looking back and saying, wow, that was a great day. It was well-rounded. It started with a little of this, and then add a little of that. And we don't look at the big picture. That's not so much our nature. Our nature is to just look at things as being very, very sort of disconnected, disjointed pieces and chunks. And that's how we experience life. Now, in all fairness, this is not necessarily all that bad because, firstly, having the capacity to consider things separate from others allow us to move forward in difficult situations when we would otherwise be sort of trapped or stuck in the past. Unfortunately, if a person suffers from PTSD, they may very likely be unable to detach themselves from a traumatic experience in the past. And the way they experience is they continue to remain sort of stuck in the past. They're unable to differentiate between what's happening now and what happened maybe many, many years earlier. But that's an abnormality. That's what happens when the system goes awry and something's off and needs to be addressed and needs to be essentially treated. But the normal functioning of a person is such that when we experience things that make us feel bad, we have the capacity, we have the wherewithal to be able to move forward from those. And that is a gift. Chazal referred to shechicha, the ability to forget, as being something which is a positive thing. Of course, there are certain things that we don't want to forget. If we learn something, we don't want to forget it. If somebody did a great favor for us, we don't want to forget it. We want to be able to express hakaras hatov. We want to be able to learn from bad experiences. At the same time, being able to move forward and not be trapped in memories that would otherwise be very, very painful and debilitating, that's a good thing. Rav Eli Meir Bloch, who was one of the Rosh Yeshiva, the Telz Yeshiva, who was completely decimated by the Nazis. The Bnei Yeshiva and the Rebbeim and the families were all killed by the Nazis. There were several of the Rosh Yeshiva and the staff of the Telz Yeshiva came to the United States before Telz was rounded up and killed by the Nazis, and that they ultimately came to rebuild the yeshiva over here. But Rav Bloch wrote a letter in 1943 in which he talks about the importance of sort of looking forward and looking to rebuild the yeshiva, and he reflects upon the name that Yosef gave his Bechor. Yosef HaTzadik, when it comes to Mitzrayim, in source number 42, we know that obviously he had a very, very painful experience beforehand, and he was, as we would say today, traumatized. He was sold by his brothers, almost killed and left for dead, and he found himself in a foreign land, and he had to learn a new language. Obviously, very, very complicated. And he gets married, and he has a child. And what does he name that son? Vayikra Yosef Shem Bechor Menashe, Ki Nashani Elokim Es Kol HaMalevi Es Kol Beis Avi. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given me the capacity to forget. Beis Avi, my father's home, as Kol HaMali, the suffering, the toil. In other words, Yosef is recognizing by naming his son this, that he has been given the ability, the capacity to be able to not remain stuck in the past, to be able to take painful experiences from the past and to leave them in a certain place and to look forward and to try to build and to grow. And Reb Bloch reflects upon how important it is for us not to remain stuck in the past, the vision of trying to say that we can never succeed in rebuilding what was lost, so why even bother? But recognize that this is where we are today, and we have to sort of make the best of it. But there is a downside to this, because when we look at life, when we experience life as being just a lot of separate, disjointed parts, so then we, as the expression goes, we miss the forest for the trees. We sort of miss the big picture. And so much of life's beauty can only be perceived through the tapestry of events and experiences and memories and thoughts and emotions. And when all we see is dots and we fail to connect them, so we have failed to appreciate many aspects of life. What I'd like to do is highlight several areas and where I think chizuk in this area is necessary. The idea of being of learning the secret of chazi litztufe, that when things in life seem disjointed and disconnected, of bringing them together and learning how we can grow from that. So number one, small things matter. What do I mean by that? It can be many different things. But Chazal tell us that specifically in the realm of Avodas Hashem, we should be very careful not to fall into the trap to think that if something is not a big zach, if something is not a mitzvah chamura, therefore it's not important. Chazal warned us. This is alluded to in the word ekev. Al ya ekev tishma'un. So Chazal tell us the word ekev, in this context, it may literally mean sort of like because, but it also means heel. It means heel, the heel of one's foot. Yaakov is called Yaakov is called Yaakov because he held on to the heel of Esav. So Chazal tell us that there are certain mitzvos that a person is dash ba'akevav. There are mitzvos that a person tramples with his foot. What does that mean? Obviously, it's not to be understood literally. It's a metaphor. But there are certain mitzvos that are sin. We consider them so insignificant. We don't consider them to be so important that we just trample them. We don't take them so seriously. And the Medrash tells us that David HaMelech, in the pasuk, he says, "Lama ira b'mei ra avona kevai yisubeni." David HaMelech says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, "Ein misyari min hamitzvos chamuros shebetorah." I'm not afraid about the mitzvos chamuros, the real serious ones. I'm not afraid b'mtei chamuros, because the chamuros, so I know I take them seriously. Aval misyari mibnei hakalos. I'm afraid about the mitzvahs kalos shem avarti aleim ibnei shem kalos. Vato amarta b'zoy b'mitzvah kalos b'chamura. And you tell us, you told me that we should take small mitzvahs seriously as well. As the pasuk says, "Va'ya ekev tishmun." So Chazal reflect upon the fact that it is human nature to essentially discriminate between different types of mitzvahs. Mesilas Yesharim in Perek Yud, when he's talking about the mid of Nikios, talks about this as well and says that there are certain mitzvahs. Chazal tell us, Rubam begazel, umiyutam barayos, that many people, unfortunately, are nichshal, are not careful when it comes to handling other people's money. You people sin in areas of immorality, even though, of course, the temptation. Where is that possible? Because, says the Mesilas Yesharim, because this is mipnei rov dakuso, because it is so slight and so seemingly insignificant, kol b'nei adam nichshalim bo v'mashi'im makirim oso, because they do not recognize this. Sefer Alishur points out an idea which is so powerful, and that is that he says, we can see within nature, we can see within the natural world something which helps us understand the spiritual world. Within the natural world, we see lots of things, big things. But all these big things are made up of smaller things, atoms, elements. Our body is comprised of cells. What we see is not really what's happening. We think that we're seeing the big thing, but that big thing is nothing more than a composite of many small things. And he says this should be used as a template to understand the spiritual universe as well. Our spiritual world, our spiritual lives, our spiritual success is nothing more than the sum of many small parts. And so we should understand and appreciate that even what seems to be small and insignificant, that is also a very big part of our story. The Chassam Sofer, in his commentary on Parshas Eikev, says, there's a halacha. The Torah tells us that a person is not permitted to withhold wages from a worker. When a person goes ahead and does the job, I'm supposed to pay them. And failure to do so could be a very serious violation. About Tolan. So the Chassam Sofer asks the question, why is it? Why is it? So Hashem should pay us on time. So asks the Chassam Sofer. And he answers so beautifully. He says, Hashem does pay us on time. Of course he pays us. He pays us when the job is done. And when is the job done? When we leave this world. We make the mistake sometimes to think, oh, I had a great day. I had an amazing day. I'm awesome. I'm great. Now I can sit back and rest. Or I had a very difficult day, or I had a difficult few days, or I had a lousy week. So therefore it's all over. It says, no. That's a terrible attitude. Says the Chassam Sofer, HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't reward us, doesn't pay us in this world because the job's not done. And our job in this world is to build ourselves step by step with lots and lots of different parts. There's another point that I would like to make over here, and that is how change occurs. We know that without a doubt, Rebbe Kiva has the distinction of being one of the most accomplished and illustrious teachers in our history. Remarkably, his lessons were not limited to the shiurim that he taught and to the great teachings of Rebbe Kiva that we find, but his own life experiences provide us with almost endless insight and inspiration. And he remains an incredible model of faith and commitment. And perhaps he is one of the most famous Bali Tshuva in all of history. Rebbe Kiva, we know, was a shepherd for 40 years. And he was the last person that anyone would have thought would have been a successful Bal Tshuva candidate, Kiruv candidate. The Gemara is very clear that the pre-Rebbe Kiva, right, when Rebbe Kiva was not yet Rebbe Kiva, he was not only apathetic towards religion and its representatives, but he was actually hostile. He had great disdain for Torah scholars, which are recorded in detail, and we're presented with a picture again who was a very unlikely candidate for Kiruv. And everybody knows what happens. The story that is very famous, which is found in Avos Rebbe Nassan, source number 49, tells us that one day, when he is shepherding his flock, he comes to a Be'er Mayim, and he notices that the water seems to be, shaping a rock and boring a hole in the rock. And he turns to others who were there and he says, "What's going on over here?" And they explain to him, well, here's what happens. The water falls every day, drip, 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 and it shapes the rock. And Rebbe Kiva sees this, and it's like the light goes on. It's this moment, it's great epiphany. Miyad, Rebbe Kiva is done kavachomer ma'atzma. When he says, "Ma rach pasal asakasha," water which is soft penetrates the hard stone. Divrei Torah shekashim bezat kabarzel. Divrei Torah, which is as hard as iron. Al achas kama v'kama she chakaku as libi shubasav adam. It could penetrate my heart, which is basav adam. Now, it's an inspiring story, but as sophisticated adults, we should ask ourselves, what's going on over here? First of all, anyone who has experience with those who are apathetic or hostile towards religion knows that such breakthroughs are highly improbable. What was the chiddush? What was this great novelty that was so astounding to trigger such a revolutionary transformation within Rebbe Kiva? Was the logic so compelling? And is it likely that they'd never seen this before? He was a shepherd. He spent a lot of time outdoors. How is it possible? Anybody ever went on a hike? You've seen this before. Rebbe Kiva's metamorphosis was from secular to holy. It wasn't from ignoramus to a scholar. He was a knowledgeable person. So could it be that for 40 years he was never made aware of this remarkable ability of water to penetrate stone? So perhaps we're looking at this story incorrectly. Perhaps we're not really understanding what's going on over here. And maybe with a little more precision, we can zero in on Rebbe Kiva's discovery. It's possible that when he set out on that day, he was already well aware of the reality that Torah has the power to affect change in a person. But with 40 years of experience and 40 years of becoming quite set in his ways, he cannot imagine how that would ever come about. How's that? What's it going to look like? I'm going to walk into base of Medrash. I'm going to pick up a sefer, listen to a shir. What purpose would that serve? I'm already 40 years old. I'm far beyond such trivial attempts at spirituality. And then he saw the water in the rock. And for the first moment in his life, perhaps he realizes not that change occurs, but how it does. Little by little, step by step, the rock begins to transform. Each drop by itself seems insignificant, but it is making a profound remark. And the cumulative effect is astounding. And Rabbi Kiva basically at that moment decides, I am going to start a process. I'm going to start a process. I'm not going to say to myself, where can I end up in a year or 2 or 5 or 10 or 20 years? I have no idea. But I'm going to start the process because I understand and appreciate that even though you don't necessarily see it and feel it day by day, this is how change takes place. And there are so many learning opportunities that we have in our communities. It started with Daf Yomi, and I was Mishnah Yomi, and Nach Yomi, and Daf Yomi Ba'alacha Yomi. So many different Yomi scheduled learning programs, which work for some. Others may find them to be a little gimmicky. But the fact of the matter is, as we know often in life, perfect becomes the enemy of the good. And there is not going to be any one program that's going to be perfect for any person. But the idea is to have a schedule when a person has the ability to go ahead and to commit to something in which there will be a constant but steady exposure to something which will function sort of like that water on the rock. It will slowly but surely be able to make a difference, a dent, a discernible one in a person's life. This is not only true when it comes to learning, it's true when it comes to midos. The Sefer Chinuch in Mitzvah Tez Zayin also related to the Pesach story when talking about the prohibition of breaking a bone when eating carbon Pesach, tells us in his very famous description of this mitzvah, Acharei ha'pu'ulos nimshacham alavavos, that human nature is such that talking about something doesn't change it. It doesn't change our attitudes. Reading books and hearing a great shiur and tapping into some inspiring thought, watching some amazing video, this is not going to change us. If we want to become better people, if we want to become more focused and sort of committed to a certain set of values and beliefs, the way we do it is by changing our actions. And this can absolutely happen slowly but surely over time. The Rambam tells us this is true when it comes to chesed as well. The Rambam Pirkei Avos, the Mishnah Pirkei Avos tells us hakol lefi rov hamaseh, which means it also always follows the majority of one's ways. And the Rambam, the Parish Mishnah, tells us what this means is that if a person has a lot of money to give as a tzedakah, and you have two approaches. One is to give all of it to one person or all of it to two people. Let's say I have $1 million. I'm going to write $1 million check to one person, or give each person $500,000, or I can give $100 to 10,000 people, or maybe $10,000 to 100 people. Says the Rambam, it is better to perform more acts of chesed. And says the Rambam, I'll tell you why. Because it will make you a more generous person. It will make you into a kinder person. When you are the kind of person who's giving again and again and again, even if they're smaller acts, it will shape you. It will shape who you become. I would like to talk about another topic that I think relates to this idea of being mitzdaref, of joining together, again, the separate, disjointed, disconnected aspects of our life. One of the most important mitzvahs in the Torah is the mitzvah of Yichud Hashem, to be miyachid Shem Hashem. This is one of the mitzvahs timidios. The Sefer Chinuch famously teaches that there are 6 mitzvahs that apply always, at all times. And among them is the mitzvah of Yichud Hashem. This appears on the surface to be a very elusive mitzvah. What exactly does it mean? How do we fulfill this mitzvah? But if we distill it and not reduce it, but if we sort of contemporize the mitzvah and try to understand what it means in the most simple terms, the mitzvah of Yichud Hashem is to understand and to appreciate and to see the world and experience the world in a way in which we realize that everything is coming from Hashem. That hakol me'ito yisbarach, that everything comes from Him, and all the things that are happening to me at any given time are a reflection that when a person recites a bracha on good news, it should also be in the same manner that recites bracha on bad news. And the Gemara says, how is that possible? After all, it's not the same bracha. On good news, a person says Atov HaMeitiv. On bad news, he says Dayna MS. So says the Gemara, no. What this means is L'kublina b'simcha, that a person should be in a state of mind of simcha when reciting the bracha of Dayna MS. How is that possible? Would we ever want to see a person, God forbid, at the Levaya, tearing Kriya, reciting the bracha of Dayna MS and giggling his way through that? He should be laughing. So Rashi tells us now what simcha means. Simcha over here, says Rashi, means levarech amidus pranios belevav shalem, which means with a complete heart, which means the concept of recognizing and appreciating that everything comes from Him. Understanding and appreciating that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the one unifying force in all of life, and it is a place where I can bring all of the conflicting and differing and all over the place emotions and thoughts and experiences that I have, instead of bringing them together in a way that enables me to make sense out of my life. Failure to do so, says the Chovos HaLevavos, leads to an experience which he calls Pizur HaNefesh. Pizur HaNefesh is a term, which is a fascinating term, which describes a person who's scattered, but he's scattered souled, not scattered brained, right? He's scattered soul. His soul's all over the place. And the Chovos HaLevavos, he speaks about this in the introduction to Shar Bitachon, says that this is the opposite of Bitachon. Bitachon is a person who's grounded, who has a certain menuchas nefesh, understands that and internalizes the message that I can be in a great state of inner calm and peace and tranquility, regardless of what's going on around me. I could have tremendous turmoil in my life, but at the same time, being able to ground myself in the notion that it's all coming from Him. The Darish Mordechai Drak, has such a beautiful piece where he talks about Yisro. The Torah tells us that Yisro wakes up, he hears about Yetzias Mitzrayim and Kriyas Yamsuf, and he's amazed by it and decides to basically change his whole life. And of course, Chazal wonder, Yisro wasn't the only one who knew what was going on. The whole world heard about this. Why was it that Yisro changed his life? So Drak says very interestingly that Yisro, Chazal tell us, his name was Yeser, and he was Zoche because he changed his life to have a Vav added to his name. What exactly does that mean? Yeser, it goes to Yisro. So Drak explains that the Vav is the Vav HaChibur, which means that he was able to connect the separate, disconnected, disjointed parts in his life. A lot of times in life, people see things and they don't connect the dots. An amazing thing happens here, an amazing thing there. Very nice. What does that have to do with me? Absolutely nothing. But Yisro was not that kind of person. He saw these things happening, and it made a roshim on him. It made a difference. And he started to think about what this means. And he put all the pieces together, and it changed his life. It changed his life because he recognized that I can't just view these things as being devarim ufuzarim all over the place, to be in a state of pizur nefesh, but rather he had to sort of bring it all together. And the Rav Mordechai Drak, he contrasts this with Achashverosh. Achashverosh, at the end of the Megillah, the very end, it says, Vayosem hamelech Achashverosh Matzah la'oretz b'yayam. At the very end of the Megillah, it says Achashverosh raised taxes. Why? Because he wanted a party. He wanted more parties. Who's going to pay for them? The people. Why is this significant? So Drak says, if you take a look at Achashverosh's name at the end of the Megillah, it's written Chaser. There's no Vav in there. It's spelled Aleph Ches Shin Reish Shin. No Vav in there. He loses his Vav. What happened to his Vav? So says Rav Drak, Achashverosh at the end of the entire story, the whole Purim story, he still doesn't get it. He didn't see the way everything came together, God's master plan. He missed it. All the dots in his mind remained completely disconnected, and they didn't affect him. And all he's thinking about is how he could raise more money to have more parties. So he loses that Vav HaChibur. Yisro receives the Vav HaChibur, but Achashverosh loses it. Some of you who know me know that I'm not the person that you go when you want to talk about schoolos. It's, for the most part, it's my way of thinking, and it's also just by a tradition that I received in my yeshiva. As you know, I come from a yeshiva which has a very Litvish bend, and there's not much room or space or tolerance sometimes for some of the schools that have become very, very popularized within the community. I try to be respectful when people ask me questions about schools and stuff like that, because I understand and appreciate that at the times that people are really looking for something to connect to, something to enable them to do something at a time when they're feeling lost. And I try to be respectful of it, but I'm not a big schooler kind of guy. Okay, that being said, every rule has an exception. And even within the Brisker tradition, there is one schooler, which actually there are stories that are told within the Brisker family. The Brisker Rav's life was saved on multiple occasions with this schooler. But then Nefesh Chaim writes about a schooler related to the words Ein Od Milvado. The pasuk tells us, Atar Reisel Adas Ki Hashem Elokim Ein Od Milvado. There is no one besides Him. And Nefesh Chaim writes in Shar Gimel, Ube'emes U'inyin Gadol, a school and a flaw. This is a great school. Lahaser Levatel Miyalav Kol Dinim Risonos Acherim. The way a person can remove, to detach himself and protect himself from forces from the outside, from things that threaten him, even from within. When a person establishes in his heart and says, Hello Hashem Elokim Amiti. Hashem is the true God. Ve'ein od milvado yizbarach shem koach ba'olam chol olam esklal. There's no one else out there that realizes it. It could be in the school of Menuchas HaNefesh. Earlier today, I had a woman tell me that she unfortunately has to have a scan every 3 months because of a very stubborn cancer that will not leave her body. And in order to monitor it, she is unfortunately, I mean, thankfully, the technology just to have it properly monitored, but every 3 months. So it's the kind of thing that's always on her mind. And when she goes in for her scheduled scan, she sits there in the doctor's office and she's saying to Hillam, and she realizes that very, very, very soon she's going to get an update on her situation, and that's obviously very overwhelming. And then she says, and when they call her in, she closes it to Hillam, and she just closes her eyes, and she says the words "Ein od mavado" again and again and again and again, and that's what she takes with her into the scan, and recognizes at that point, completely surrenders herself to the will of the Ribono Shel Olam. It says at the end of the day, no matter what they're going to tell me, no matter what I'm going to hear, no matter what the prognosis is going to be, I'm reminding myself, Ein od milvado. And that is a tremendous skula. It enables a person to be, at that moment, when they would otherwise be sort of, like I said, sort of all over the place, to be able to sort of bring themselves together and focus and to recognize Ein od milvado. There's a beautiful book that I'd like to recommend called Living in the Presence by Dr. Benjamin Epstein, where he talks about the sugi of mindfulness. The whole world is talking about this today. We had it first, but this idea that I'm trying to talk about is one that comes from it's very writes that the pasuk says in Sefer Tehillim, "Shivisi Hashem lenegdi tamid." Shivisi Hashem lenegdi tamid. He quotes in the Baal Shem Tov a very beautiful way to understand this pasuk. We translate the pasuk usually as Shivisi Hashem lenegdi tamid, that I place Hashem before me at all times. Shivisi Hashem lenegdi tamid. So he explains a little differently. Shivisi is an expression of hishtavut, which means equanimity, equilibrium, a state in which the response to all stimuli, for instance, whether a person is praised or shamed, will always be consistent and measured with a balance and steadiness. Another is the idea over here is the pasuk is to be read like this: Shivisi Hashem lenegdi tamid. If I understand that Hashem is lenegdi tamid, so Shivisi, I'm going to be in a constant state of equilibrium. I'm going to be able to remain calm, cool, and collected at all times, no matter what's going on around me, within me. This idea of being mitzdaref, of joining together all the disjointed, disconnected experiences and thoughts and feelings and emotions in life and bringing them together. I want to conclude. You see, I have a long quote over here on the sheet, forgive me, by showing you this is what the inside of a Sefer Torah looks like, specifically by the Shiras Hayam. If you take a look in Parshas Peshalach, which we're going to read on the 7th day of Pesach, the Az Yashir is written in a very, very unusual way. Usually when you look at a paragraph in the Torah, it is a word followed by a small space, and then the next word, followed by another space, and the next word. But over here, you have a pattern, a certain format, which is described by Chazal as Areach HaGadol Levena. It's like the way bricks are laid one on top of the other. And what it appears over here is like a lot of empty spaces. A lot of empty spaces. Why is that? Why is it that Shira has empty spaces? So there's a medrash in Shmos Rabbah which tells us that at the time of the Shira, so we know Uz Yashir Moshe, Uz Yashir, Uz. At that moment, then Moshe sang. So Chazal, who are very attuned and very sensitive to the words in the Torah, tell us, wait a second, Uz, 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 and remind us that earlier in Sefer Shemos, Moshe, when he goes to Paro, and that mission was not very successful from his perspective, he complains to Ribono Shel Olam. He says, "Mi Uz Basi al Paro." Ever since the time you sent me to go to Paro, things have gone downhill, and this isn't working, and it's not a good plan, and this is not working. He's very frustrated, and he's complaining that he's seeing is empty spaces. He's seeing things that don't fit together, things that don't add up. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu is obviously disappointed with Moshe's perspective at that time, but he encourages him to stay with it, and Moshe does. And then after Yetzias Mitzrayim and Kriyas Yamsuf, when Moshe is standing there, Vayar Yisrael and Mitzrayim Yisas Vasayam, and then Uz Yashir Moshe. And Chazal say Uz, Moshe comes back to Ribono Shel Olam. He says, I'm sorry. I know that I said, May Uz Basi al Paro, that I doubted you that I somehow didn't questions in the world that can sometimes not be properly answered. We have unresolved challenges. We have unsolved puzzles. But at this moment, he came to realize that those spaces are not empty. They are filled. They are filled as well, even though we can't always see what's in there at the moment. We are living in such a difficult time in history. Once again, another Pesach, which we are trying to prepare for, the recognition and the understanding that there's a lot of turmoil in the world. There's a war in Ukraine, a very concerning spike in terrorism in Israel, problems domestically and abroad. How do we take any comfort going into the Pesach Seder? So there's a very interesting, with this I'll conclude, there's a very interesting and really strange and peculiar custom we have to split the Hallel at the Pesach Seder. It's strange because normally Hallel does not tolerate any hefsek. Halacha is, source number 66, you're not permitted to divide your Hallel. But on the night of the Pesach Seder, we do. We actually divide the Hallel in half, not straight down the middle, but we divide it. We say the first two paragraphs before the meal, and then we stop for a meal, and then we say the rest of the Hallel later. Why is that okay? Why is that sort of tolerated? So one of the ways that this is explained is in light of the comment of the Ran. The Ran in Masechus Pesachim teaches that normally when we say Hallel, it is said b'toras kriya, which means we are reading it. It's almost like we are reading a script. What we are doing is we are following a certain text. And by doing so, we're not necessarily fully internalizing the messages of Hallel. We're not necessarily naturally, spontaneously praising from the depths of our soul. But we're trying to express a certain set of emotions that are appropriate for the moment. That's Hallel b'toras kriya. But at the Pesach Seder, when we hopefully achieve a sense of real gilui, when we are able to appreciate something about the world and inside of ourselves, when we hopefully come to that point of Chai Vadim Misrayim, so says the Ran, our Hallel is recited b'toras shira. It's not b'toras kriya, it's shira. It's a song. It's spontaneous. It's genuine. It's coming from within. And such a Hallel can absolutely tolerate a hefsek, because suddenly there is no hefsek. It may seem as if there's an empty space there, but those empty spaces become filled in. It may seem as all I'm doing is around sitting around and eating with my family, but there's a certain consistency that comes from without. And so therefore, on this night, we have the capacity to be mitzaref, to join together so many of this disjointed and disconnected aspects of our life. And if we can successfully do so, hopefully we can be inspired to consider ways of growth in general, ways that we can look to improve our life little by little by appreciating how little acts of kindness and little acts of Torah study and little things here and little things there can add up and really make a big, big difference in our life. And hopefully if we do so, we'll be zoche to experience Pesach in the most inspirational way, that it will be a Yom Tov which inspires us to grow and to learn and to achieve a state of true menuchas hanefesh, not to be in a state of pizra hanefesh, but to be in a state in which we say Shivisi, Hashem lenegdi tamid, to remember the power of Ein Od Mevado, to remember that that even though our life's all over the place and we have so many things going on at any given time, and everything's completely disconnected, the reminder says Ein Od Mevado, to properly be miyachid Shem Hashem, and hopefully by doing so, we'll be able to find more comfort in our life, more genuine sense of bitachon and menuchas hanefesh. Wishing each and every one of you a chag kosher v'sameach. Thank you so much.